Good afternoon and welcome to this session, which is on doubling down on energy efficiency of buildings, a dialogue on heating, cooling and passive design. My name's Jo Da Silva. I'm the Global Director of Sustainable Development at Arup. For those of you who don't know Arup, we're a independent firm of planners, designers, engineers, technical specialists. We design probably around 1,000 buildings a year across 100 and something countries. So we have quite a big perspective. We have various people in our organization who are deep experts on passive design, heating and cooling, who have been prepping me for today. And some of you I recognize because you were in the sessions yesterday. There was a very good session on passive design, also one on heating and cooling, and some of the speakers have been brought forwards to these panels, and I hope will bring some of the messages forwards. Just to set the scene and the context for this discussion is, of course, the agreements at COP28 to triple renewables, but to do that in conjunction with doubling energy efficiency improvements. And those two things need to go hand in hand. Buildings, as we know, play a really significant role in this. We can't get there, we can't reach the Paris agreements unless we address the fact that buildings are accountable for 34%, a third of global energy demand, and 37% of energy-related emissions. But what does it mean in practice to get there? Well, let's start with some good news. I'm an engineer. When I was initially trying to improve the energy efficiency of buildings back in the 1990s, the big issue was actually lighting. And we've made huge progress over the last 20, 30 years as lighting has switched over to low energy LED lighting and smart systems that switch the lights off, when people aren't occupying buildings. But what that means now is that heating and cooling are the predominant energy uses. And the IEA has estimated that we actually need to reduce energy consumption for heating by 30% by 2030. And we also, at the same time, need to avoid a huge increase in energy demand for cooling. And that's in an environment where temperatures are going up and up and up. So places like the UK, we experience 40 degrees in the summer, not last summer, the one before. This summer, I don't think it got above 26, which is kind of normal. So there are places like the UK sort of thinking they want cooling that they haven't had cooling before. And then obviously other parts of the world are hitting temperatures as high as 50 degrees. Here in Paris, they were 35 degrees last summer, but by 2050, it's very likely that the temperatures here in Paris will peak at 50 degrees. And in this environment, maintaining indoor comfort conditions can actually be a matter of life and death. 475,000 people died of heat last year, not necessarily indoors, but buildings are a big moderator to the climate, and we have to really recognize that. But buildings, air conditioning isn't the answer. That's the sort of first thing people leap to. We'll just have more air conditioning, more cooling. But that requires more energy, and the answer to that is renewable energy, but we're competing with electric vehicles and industry that is transitioning to renewable energy. So it's actually very complicated. There's not a kind of quick fix. And then I also want to mention that the fact that the demand for cooling is also affected very much by heat island effects in cities. And we have done work in my organization recently. We've created a tool that uses satellite imagery and artificial intelligence to create urban heat maps of cities. And it's pretty sobering because it's highlighted temperature differentials up to 10 degrees within cities. And we've modeled cities ranging from Cairo to London to Singapore. And in every city, the coolest areas are where there are water bodies and open spaces, whereas the hottest are dense areas with buildings that are made of materials that radiate heat, often where poorer and more marginalized communities live. So this is actually an equity issue, not just a climate issue, and how we plan cities impacts the demand for cooling, and nature is very much part of the solution. And that's why a lot of European cities have trees planted all the way down the streets. because those trees actually provide shading and they actually prevent the sun directly on the buildings. But today, we're focusing specifically on buildings and how to improve their energy performance and reduce the amount of energy they use. And the good news is that the International Energy Agency has shown that the solutions largely exist, and we can get 40% of the way there with solutions that exist already today. And the approach is also pretty clear, and that's really the structure of today. The first is to use passive design principles to reduce the need for energy. The British call it fabric first, actually recognizing that it's the way, the materials that buildings are constructed of, how well they're insulated, etc., that actually provides the first level of defense, either against cold weather or against hot weather. And the second strategy then is to use energy more efficiently by adopting smart systems and appliances. And then the third is making sure we've got decarbonized energy as the source for those appliances. So it's a fairly clear approach, but what we're going to do today is we've got two panels, and you can hear how that's really playing out in practice. And what really matters is the relationships between the people who are developing the technologies and the environment they need from governments in terms of regulation, policy frameworks, etc., to actually drive that demand so we actually can deliver at pace and at scale. I also want to point out that we've got two very different problems here, because in the UK, Europe, United States, and actually now much of China, 80% of the buildings that are going to exist in 2050 exist today. And they will all need to be retrofitted, or the majority of them will need to be retrofitted. Whereas conversely, in Africa, in South and parts of Southeast Asia, urbanization is approaching 5% a year, and 80% of the buildings that will exist in 2050 have not yet been built. And we're already, today, building a city the size of Paris in square meters every week. So to realize that demand, we're going to be keeping on building cities the size of Paris right the way through to 2050. So we have to do things differently. And we have to also think within cities about the different building typologies, offices, schools, hospitals, in particular housing. Who owns these assets? Who's funding the retrofitting or the new build? It's a very, very complex ecosystem of actors and agents. The challenge isn't how we do it, it's simply how fast we do it, and making sure that we do it for everyone, and that includes the 1 billion people who are currently living in informal settlements. They too need cooling and protection from extreme weather. So in our first panel discussion, we're going to focus on new buildings, and the UN High-Level Climate Champions 2030 Breakthrough have set a target for 100% of new buildings projects completed in 2030 to be net zero in operation. That's the goal, 6 years away. There's been huge progress on this in the European Union. And in this panel, we're going to consider how governments can accelerate the change, lead by example, and prioritize energy efficiency. So to help me explore this topic, I'd like to invite to the stage Mr. Joel Aryumo Yang, Principal Secretary of the State Department of Public Works, Ministry of Land, Housing and Urban Development from Kenya. Welcome. The Honourable Nasra Nanda, Honourable Member of the Nairobi City Council Assembly and CEO of Kenya Green Building Society. Ms. Jessica Grove-Smith, Senior Scientist and Joint Managing of the Board of Directors from the Passive House Institute. Mr. Tadao Kamai from Nikon Seki Limited in Japan, Chairman of the Board of Directors. And finally, Mr. Karan Mangotra, Partnership and Strategy Specialist of the International Solar Alliance. Thank you all very much for joining us today. And I wanted to start in Kenya with Mr. Arimo Yang. Please, could you kick us off with giving us a national perspective on this issue and a sense of the region context in Kenya that shapes how you as a government are thinking about policies that relate to buildings. And I'm very interested in the regulations and planning legislation that you're introducing in Kenya.
Thank you very much. First, Africa is home to roughly 20% of world population today, and it is expected to reach over 40% by the end of the century. The continent is also projected to have the fastest urban population growth by 2050. This growing urban population is driving increased demand for energy, primarily for buildings, which accounts for 61% of the current final energy consumption in the continent. 70% of the building stock expected to exist in 2040 is yet to be built, and today only few countries have mandatory building codes. If we fail to create enabling environment for green buildings, this will lead to a significant increase in building energy demand, putting pressure on existing infrastructure and resources. With the tight policies, incentives, and knowledge sharing mechanisms, this can be scaled up across all countries represented here today. Clean energy transition in Africa must be just and equitable. Therefore, policies must address affordability gaps, ensuring everyone benefits and no one is left behind. This is crucial as we build a future where buildings are not only decisive in achieving climate targets, but also in creating thriving, resilient communities across the continent. That's the African context. At the Kenyan level, in Kenya, we recognize immense potential of energy efficiency in providing sustainable cooling solutions and greener buildings. We also recognize that achieving the Paris Agenda and doubling energy efficiency improvements in this decade requires decisive and collective action. This is why we have taken important steps as a country to establish strategic partnerships to both develop strategies and share knowledge in the region. Kenya launched the National Cooling Action Plan in 2023, aims to ensure access to cooling for various sectors, including human comfort, and a transition to sustainable and efficient cooling solutions. Last year, also Kenya endorsed a mission efficiency call to action and the COP28 renewables and energy efficiency pledge with the aim to at least double energy efficiency. Kenya National Energy Efficiency and Conservation Strategy outlines comprehensive approach to promoting energy efficiency across various sectors, including buildings. Green Growth and Investment Plan serves as the tool to engage the international community, local partners, and the private sector around investing in Kenya's green transition. Kenya is looking at its second national determined contributions update, where energy efficiency in the building sector must play a prominent role in achieving its climate change mitigation targets, as well as promoting resilience. The Kenya Housing Agenda is key as a fifth administration's agenda of our president to roll out 200,000 housing units per year and work with the private sector for the remaining 50,000. This is a target that we incorporate the Green Building Agenda. Of course, the African Climate Summit, which was launched in Nairobi, provided a platform for more engagements with partners and the private sector. The Kenya is also looking at its updating its building code, which while we are all here, this code is before the national, the Senate, our parliament, that had already gone through to be debated with the National Assembly, because their code is elaborate both at the both levels of government, national and county government. Because Kenya is organized with the devolved, 47 devolved units, and this code prescribes, of course, incorporation of technology, the performance-based hazard mapping, and also considering the climate, green building technology areas. And this fora provides Kenya with an opportunity to engage, so that if the building code is approved by Parliament, it will be able to, it will require that the population is capacity built. Planning is also done at the county level, so it will require a lot of capacity building, sensitizing public education, so that it can also be shared and therefore contribute finally to the climate agenda, which to reduce the problem we are facing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that is a perfect segue, I think, to pass on the conversation to the Honourable Ms. Nanda. I mean, in your role both in the city of Nairobi, which is one of the 47, I think, counties in Kenya, but also in your role at the Green Building Council, how has the changes to policy and regulation that are coming down from the government and the commitments at national level, how are those playing out at the next scale?
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Firstly, good afternoon. I think Kenya has really set the tone in terms of driving the climate and development agenda in Africa. And as highlighted by the Principal Secretary, we made several commitments at the Africa Climate Summit. And at the end of COP28, what was key was the role of cities in climate conversation, where CHAMP and the financing around cities was really recognized. So how does that play a role in Kenya? Nairobi is really the green capital of Africa, if not the world. And I say this because even from a leadership perspective, we have the first IFC Edge Green Government Office in Africa. And what we're really trying to do is lead by example, so that eventually the national commitments are now replicated at county level. So we're at the point where the governor has certified his office to signal to the market that now we are on the path of translating national commitments into city level or local government level commitments by unlocking the segue to green legislation at county level, with a focus, of course, on embedding green building principles and also seeing how green building principles can work in cities, where really cities are an ecosystem of opportunities and challenges that county governments have to solve. And really what that looks like is, when you're looking at a city as an ecosystem, you're looking at how biodiversity works for cities or as a service to cities, and how biodiversity could potentially unlock opportunities for biodiversity credits, so that we can now complement the role of buildings with nature to support that ecosystem in a way that is climate positive, or for people and planet. Separately, as we are looking at commitments from a local county perspective, we're not doing it in isolation. We have two, or rather three, really key priority areas, both at national and county level. And number one is the affordable housing agenda, which the Principal Secretary mentioned. There's an affordable housing bill that is being debated, and we're trying to push for the greening component in the affordable housing agenda. And similarly with the building code, what we're trying to say is, you're not just building buildings. These are going to affect the affordable housing agenda. They're going to also feed into the ecosystem, which brings me to the next key priority for Kenya, which is building climate resilience for the urban poor. we're looking at the role of buildings in the context of ecosystems. And that's really the approach Kenya is taking, because we need to understand that if you really want to go far, you can focus on buildings. But if you want to go further, you have to look at communities and the context that buildings play in empowering communities. So that means that little microforest conversation that I talked about, how does it build climate resilience for the urban poor, translating energy efficiency in both formal and informal settlements? And that's going to be a key priority for both national and county level, because now we're looking at a pilot on how that translates in a city or in cities in Kenya, where we're building the affordable housing component, the ecosystem component, and both the formal and informal sector component. Of course, this is done both to ensure that as we green and create energy efficient systems, we also empower people and unlock the capacity building partnerships that will help Kenya go to the next level, but also unlock the necessary and much needed climate finance to empower our government and the private sector to deliver the solutions on all capacities and all layers of government. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I've had the good fortune to spend quite a lot of time in Kenya working. I love Nairobi as a city. It's an extremely complex city. But cities are very much at the front line of change, but they can only realize that change within an environment that national government produces. And I think what comes across really strongly is the importance of thinking about not treating this as a technocratic problem, but actually recognizing that buildings are about people and they are about nature, and we've got to make that one conversation. Which brings me on to Ms. Grove-Smith from the Passive House Institute. And I would like to leave you to explain to the audience what passive design really means. What are passive design principles, and how have the Passive House Institute applied those successfully? And are they more widely applicable in other parts of the world?
Thank you for the very interesting question, and welcome. Nice to be here. Very honored to be on this panel with the other speakers. Yes, diving into the details of passive designs, the potentials of that, passive principles in generally, and how it's applied as part of the Passive House standard and Passive House concept. So Passive House, when we speak about passive design principles, it's in the name. It's about the design of the building, right? So it's really about looking at the local context, the local climate, and optimizing the building fabric, the building strategy, so that we create an environment for the people. Again, it's about the people, creating an environment for the people that is comfortably warm during cold periods, it's comfortably cool during hot periods, without having to rely massively on energy input for heating and cooling. I really like the term that you used before in terms of creating a first level of defense. It is for the people, and it creates kind of a barrier between the extreme uncomfortable outside and a place that we can live and work in within the building. So it's really, really effective in terms of how we can just design and build differently to minimize our energy needs for heating and cooling. Now, there are many different passive design strategies. As I said, it depends on the local context. It depends on the climates. The solutions obviously look different in a hot climate, whether it's arid or whether it's humid or whether in cold climates. And there are also different levels of passive design strategies. There are some very simple ones that you can implement very effectively and very easily everywhere around the world, but you can also take this to a very, very far level, which is what we've incorporated and what the Passive House standard had basically come out of. So for the Passive House standard, it's based very much on passive design principles, but taken it and formed it into a precise building standard that is then fabric first approach, efficiency first, leading to very, very low heating and cooling demands. The idea there is to form it into an actual tangible and very clearly defined standard and methodology that you can give designers to the clients to work towards. Now, it's come out of Central Europe. So when the Passive House standard was first defined, it came out of Germany to see how far can we take this, how low down can we drive heating demand. But it is purely outcome based, right? So really embracing those passive design principles to drive down heating and cooling. Physics is physics. I'm a physicist myself. and physics is the same around the world. So the principles apply internationally, and we have seen this passive house strategy and concept grow internationally. There's some really great examples coming out of China, for example, which has to deal with extremely cold, but also extremely hot and humid weather spills in the summer. If I may, in terms of passive design, there's one other thing that I'd like to touch on, which why passive design is so important. It's not only about driving down the energy demand, which in itself is a really, really important thing for decarbonization, right? What's really important is that passive design is such a door opener for other aspects. If we're talking about net zero, for example, our overall targets, we can only achieve sustainable clean energy supply, have those aspirations of electrification if we drive down the energy demand first. So that all comes hand in hand. Coming back to the people, passive design, passive house, provides resilience. It gives you that protection from the outside environment. It provides well-being. It provides health for the people. And there's also the aspects of the energy bills and fuel poverty that we need to be thinking about. So, yes, passive design really as a door opener. Passive design is a big term. The solutions look differently around the world. There are simple methodologies that you can apply, but we can take it all the way to the passive house standard and make sure we really drive down energy demand.
Thank you. And many of the principles of passive design actually exist in vernacular architecture, but we've abandoned a lot of those principles. And there's a lot to be learnt by going back to the way people built centuries ago, because although the temperature is changing rapidly now, it hasn't actually changed a huge amount over the last few hundred years. We've talked about solutions, passive design solutions. Our next speaker is from Japan, Mr. Tadao Kamei. And Mr. Kamei, as an architect, please can you give us some examples of how you're designing new buildings to take account of rising temperatures, humidity, and urban heat islands, and is there government policy in Japan that is enabling you to do things differently?
Yes. First of all, I thank you for the precious opportunity to participate in this event. I'm a chairman and architect of Nikken, which is a design consultancy firm of 2,500 architects, engineers, and planners based in Tokyo. The urban heat island phenomenon in Japan's large cities is worsening year by year. In particular, buildings and roads with a large heat capacity are heated by sunlight during the day, and the temperature does not drop at night, which has become a social problem. Nikken is taking on the challenge of designing to moderate the heat island phenomena for a long time. That is how to cool the surface of a building. I would like to explain two examples today. First, we designed a 9-story building with green screen in Tokyo. Chains are installed at the tip of the balcony, and they help plants to grow along the chains. It has been confirmed that green screen reduces the surface temperature of buildings very much. As workers look outside through the green screen, it also functions as a biophilic design. Another example is a large-scale 25-story office building, also in Tokyo, originally owned by Sony company. Its entire facade is covered with hollow ceramic pipes called bioskin. Collected rainwater circulates within the hollow part, and the rainwater permeates through the ceramic and seeps out to the surface, where evaporative cooling occurs. The size of the bioskin is measuring 140 meters in height and 140 meters in width. So it also contributes to lowering the temperature around the building. Of course, one of the causes of the heat island phenomenon is exhaust heat from air conditioning equipment. There are two ways to reduce exhaust heat: promoting energy saving and selecting a heat sink where the chiller waste that is disposed of. Regarding heat sinks, the number of projects using rivers and underground as heat sinks and heat sources for heat pumps is increasing. For example, the heat pump system at the Tokyo Skytree, which we designed, uses geothermal heat pump. Lastly, regarding the role of policy, in promoting energy saving, the actions of the Japanese government, including the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport and Tourism, are functioning effectively. An index called BEI, Building Energy Index, has been established. And this value is scheduled to be tightened in 23. I'll end my message, and thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think I was looking up the Building Energy Index, which I hadn't heard of before the event yesterday. And this is the type of thing that is really creating the market. I was on a panel earlier today talking about the World Business Council for Sustainable Development's market transformation agenda. And one of the 11 action points there is actually how do we create demand for new technologies, for designers to think and do differently. And a lot of that stems from things like the Building Energy Index and actually setting targets for utilization. Our final speaker on the panel, and thank you for your patience, is Mr. Karan Mangotra. He's from the International Solar Alliance. And I'm keen that he speaks to us a little bit about this interrelationship between tripling renewables and doubling energy efficient improvements and the role that buildings play in that energy transition.
Thank you for inviting me on this panel, and I'm really glad to be a part of this August panel where people, communities and nature are at the heart of it. So, I don't think the discussion is around ramping renewables in tandem with enhancing energy efficiency. I think the question is around accessibility and affordability. I represent the International Solar Alliance, which is currently 120 member countries strong. And one of the key aspects that we work with on all our member countries is to provide universal energy access. And the questions of accessibility and affordability are at the heart of it. Now, the trends are extremely encouraging. From the renewable side, there's been a sustained decrease in costs of solar energy, of batteries, which in turn has led to a large increase in deployment. Overall, the solar generation costs have also declined by over 10 times. And there was a 42% decline in 2021 over the 2019 numbers. Now, bringing it to the buildings and the built environment. Now, over the last a couple of days, we have heard in a lot of sessions that the stock in the global south, Africa, Asia, is yet to be built. Now, that is an amazing opportunity, both from the perspective of innovative design, where we start to embed some of these things into building design, but also on innovative financing. This brings scale and ramps down costs. Scale to embedding renewables into building stock that is going to exist in the future, and also making efficient products the most affordable ones. Now, this, of course, requires a lot of partners and partnerships to come together, and financing becomes a key aspect. Risk perceptions of such investments, especially in the global south, are relatively high. So guarantees work. Innovative models like demand aggregation have worked, especially in the lighting sector. In India, we saw a rampant decline in the prices of LED. But finance, business models make a lot of sense and work very well if you have quality design options that make economic, environmental, and social health, especially keeping people, nature, and communities at the heart of it. Solutions exist, but solutions need to be nuanced and customized. One size will not fit all. So when we are dealing with such issues around affordability and accessibility, understanding local needs, technology and design options, as well as the economics of these solutions go a long way. So one of the things that we are trying to build at the International Solar Alliance with some of the partners that are here in the room is to look at an architectural design challenge that could help develop a bouquet of these design options for a variety of geographies. So as they say that the proof of the pudding is in the eating, solutions exist, but pilots help, design challenges help, and innovative business models then ramp this up. And this could go a long way in promoting universal energy access for all, especially on a livable planet. So thank you.
That's a wonderful idea. Thank you all for your contributions. I'm mindful of time, and I want to give the audience a chance, if you have any questions, to ask questions. Is anyone got any burning questions that they'd like to ask the panel? I can barely see because the lights are so strong in this room. Oh, thank you.
A question for the two speakers from Kenya. That figure of 200,000 or 250,000 new homes a year seems quite staggering. That's a lot of homes to be building. In terms of what you're doing to ensure sort of comfort levels for the future, we've heard, in the previous session that I was at, about how the Paris Olympics is trying to build for homes in 2050. Are you looking forward in terms of building those homes, of what the conditions might be like in 2050, as well as planning for now?
Thank you for your question. I think as a starting point, I'd like to highlight that, yes, we've taken some steps. For example, the National Affordable Housing Development Framework takes into consideration health and well-being as a component when it comes to building at scale and also building for, affordable housing. So definitely we are incorporating that. But what we are also looking for, and that's why this forum is important, is to learn from people who've been in the game maybe longer than Kenya, so that together, if there are things we can learn that will, help us improve or adapt, or even in terms of, seeing a partnership where there's an opportunity. For example, I might have earlier mentioned one of the partners we're working with, Real, is we're looking at a guarantee to unlock sustainable and affordable housing, and we're trying to pilot that with a private sector player, which will then become a test case that if we start with the private sector, there's that confidence, and then we're hoping to now then loop in the government so that we can scale up. But that will do two things, or rather three. One, private sector confidence. Two, a financing component that will now unlock financing in a much needed space. And then three, doing our part to assist the government, bring the financing, the partnerships with the private sector, and then now incorporate the development framework that thinks of people first, but now, of course, with that business angle in mind. I hope I've answered your question. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. Is there any other questions? One there, and then I'm the near one here, and then that's it, I'm afraid, just in terms of time.
Thank you. My question is to the Passive House Institute. We've heard a big message throughout this forum of the importance of integrating the mitigation and the resilience aspects. And I was wondering if in the Passive House Institute you're thinking about integration of both at the same time. And if so, are there areas where there may be trade-offs between the two?
Thank you for the question. Just one clarification before I answer. Trade-off between...
So the resilience, for example, the seismic area,
Mhm.
passive design in the seismic area,
versus, so
So basically the lower emission
Yep.
versus the higher adaptation of the
Very, very good, very relevant and important question. It comes down to you need solutions that work in the local context, right? And I think it's becoming more and more important as we're in the climate warming situation. It's becoming more important to deal with aspects of adaptation, and every building design needs to take that into account. You have to find the right balance. I'm still entirely convinced, and from the projects and experiences that we have at the Institute and with kind of the community working on passive house projects, that many times those two can be combined. So the passive design, passive house approach in itself provides so much resilience in itself that we need that aspect. Like breaking that down in order to prioritize other topics brings other complications or other difficulties with it. But having said that, there are obviously aspects just as seismic activity that you cannot compromise. Right? And then those obviously go first. If it's putting people in danger, then you can't compromise on them. So it's about adapting, looking at the local context, then that pushing that efficiency and fabric first approach as far as you can. I hope that answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you. And then very quickly, the lady here.
Thank you very much, Elena Brass from the Cool Heating Coalition. Also question to Mrs. Braff-Smith. While you were talking, I was thinking, because yesterday somebody told me it's very difficult to always find the best solution and approaches for technicians and installers on the ground. Do you have, for instance, from the Passive House Institute, an app, or could it be developed, which brings people through the different steps they need to look at when they want to construct a passive house? And I could imagine such an app being configured according to the main, say, geographical, temperature type areas of the world to make it adaptable to different regions of the world. And I think that would be useful, but maybe it exists. I was just curious.
I like the idea, thank you. We don't have an app per se, but since the Passive House standard is very outcome and performance based, it incorporates energy modeling from the outset. So it's very much focused on the design, and then it has that energy modeling as an outset, and you have to model your building and focus towards finding a good design and finding the right combination of components to bring you to that performance level. We don't have it in app format. It's a simplified energy modeling so that it's manageable by designers and it doesn't require a lot of time or a lot of expertise to do that modeling. That's been the Passive House approach so far. I think with kind of technology developments, AI developments, maybe we see how there's possibilities to include it in apps. What we do have is, as a starting point to get people going, we have recommendations by climate zone in terms of what typical insulation levels or typical components you would need in a specific climate to achieve the efficiency levels of Passive House. I still think the best example is to actually speak with project teams who have done this before. Go out and visit projects. We have a database where we collect Passive House projects that have been implemented worldwide that are collected online, where you can take a look at those projects and then reach out to the design teams and have a conversation with them to learn from their experiences.
Thank you. And I recommend that you go and meet the very nice young man from Giga Regio Factory, who has one of the stalls out there, who has got a very lovely process of identifying demand for retrofitting, people who make solutions and linking those up. A really, really fantastic, innovative approach. I spoke to him in the break. On that note, I'd like to say a very sincere thank you to our panel for their insights today, and to invite the next panel up to the stage. Maybe to stop everyone bumping, maybe if the panel leaves this way and goes behind me down the steps so you don't fall down, and maybe the new panel could come up from the other end, we might make it work. Thank you. Thank you very much. So our second panel, we're going to take a slightly different tack and really focus on more on existing buildings, the challenges of energy efficiency and existing building stock, and how national and subnational governments can use policy to drive that measurable change. And I'm delighted to invite our first guest to come up to the panel, Lord Martin Callanan, Minister of Energy Efficiency and Green Finance at the UK Government. Secondly, Ms. Nuni Petrosyan, Deputy Chairman of the Urban Development Committee of Armenia in the Republic of Armenia. Ms. Paolo Pino, Director of Just Transition, Consumers, Energy Security, Efficiency and Innovation at the European Commission. And finally, Mr. Vincent Minier, Vice President for Energy Transition Research at Schneider Electric. A warm welcome to you all. To set the scene for this second part of the meeting, I wanted to share with you an example of where change really gets driven by a subnational government, in this case, New York City, who in 2019 decided to pass a local law, the Climate Mobilization Act. And essentially what that law has done is a very ambitious policy that puts the onus for retrofitting on the owners of existing buildings in Manhattan. And for those of you who've been to Manhattan, you know, it's very, very, very dense. They've got to drive down energy demand of those buildings in order to meet the pace of electrification of the grids and achieve climate targets. And it requires most buildings that are over 25,000 square feet to reach targets by 2024 and then further limits by 2030. So it's a very directive policy, very much based on buildings' performance. And the goal is to reduce the emissions produced by the city's largest buildings 40% by 2030. So that's achieving a 40% reduction this decade. But that kind of lever isn't the only one. There are other ones, like setting minimum energy performance standards for equipment. And I'd like to invite our speakers to explore some of these issues so we can see the sort of spectrum of action and interventions that can be taken. Let's start in the UK with the national government. Lord Callanan, thank you for joining us. You said outside that you've got more challenges in the UK than many other countries because we've got some of the oldest building stock in the world, and therefore mass retrofitting is critical. I think I'm right in thinking there's about 20 million homes that need to be retrofitted. How is the UK government creating a flourishing market to enable that transition?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Joe. Thank you for the invitation to participate in the discussion. And of course, you are right. In the UK, we have the oldest housing stock in Europe, certainly, which probably puts us near the top of the list globally too. To give you some context, around a third of our homes were built before the Second World War, and around 6 million of them were built before the First World War. A high proportion of these, of course, given the age, are uninsulated. They're built with solid stone or brick walls that makes them extremely difficult to and expensive to insulate retrospectively. One way that we've tried to approach this is to target public support towards those buildings is by making the eligibility for our various grant schemes not just for low-income households, but also low-income households living in the most least efficient properties. And generally, they're only accessible if you have what we call an energy performance certificate rating of D or below. Another is a delivery model that's helped to develop the retrofit market, which is an obligation, a legal obligation that we place on the energy suppliers to identify their low-income customers and then to install energy upgrades, energy efficiency upgrades in their particular properties. The advantage from our point of view is that these suppliers already have established supply chains, they already have delivery infrastructure in place, and so far they've done well. They've met their targets under every phase so far of the scheme. So we've had something like 3.7 million measures installed in 2.4 million households since 2013. And that has contributed significantly to the overall progress that we are making. So to give you some figures, we now have around half, 50% of our homes in the UK are rated at energy performance certificate level C or better for energy performance, and that's up from about 14%, so 14% in 2010 up to 50% now. So we are making progress, although we fully accept we still have an awful lot more to do. We're continuing with those policies, and the success means that we've now boosted funding for the latest version of the supplier scheme that I mentioned, which we call ECO, the Energy Company Obligation. And last year we launched an additional brand new supplier-led programme called the Great British Insulation Scheme. The other main delivery model that we use is working with our local authorities, the elected municipal governments at local level in the UK. That's proved quite challenging because of the additional procurement that's involved, but of course it does have the advantage of helping to empower those local communities to help them to implement place-based solutions. And in some parts of the country, in the older industrial areas, we've seen whole neighbourhoods that have been transformed. And it's not just improvements that you see in the energy efficiency, it's also improved the whole streetscape by installing some really clever and innovative external wall insulation. So our focus now is additionally to work with those local authorities, to help them to work with us and others more closely, helping to share resources, helping to share best practice through regional net zero hubs and through a national technical assistance facility which we've set up in central government. Finally, we've tried to give predictability going forward. We've set out long-term funding commitments for all of these energy efficiency schemes, at least long-term in central government language, trying to give confidence, long-term confidence to the supply chain that they can invest and they can upskill accordingly because of the volume of work that's coming forward. Additionally, of course, it's important to recognise that central taxpayer, central government will not be able to fund all of this work that is required. So we're going to have to find ways to help persuade and cajole households to fund some of this work themselves if our goal really is the mass retrofitting across the entire stock. The good news, of course, as we all know here, that certain efficiency measures are extremely cost effective and they provide almost instant bill savings well in excess of what it costs to install them. So that means we're engaged in a communications drive to convince the public of the importance of many of these measures, to get the message out to them. We've launched a new online tool, a telephone line, a pilot project for in-person advice. Last October, we launched a new public campaign that's running across broadcast, print, online and radio, trying to re-emphasise the importance to the public of energy efficiency measures. We've also launched a Green Home Finance Accelerator competition, working with various lenders to develop and promoting more attractive green loan products, and there's quite a lot of innovation in the financial community coming forward there as well. All this is, of course, is in line with our international obligations in the UAE COP presidency's Global Renewables and Energy Efficiency Pledge, which we signed up to, and that promised to double the rate of improvements by 2030, and we've set our own national ambition to reduce our total energy consumption by 15% by 2030. So we have to couple domestic action with, of course, that international effort, and we're delighted to see France and Morocco leading the buildings breakthrough, as it's very important that all of us can work together, can learn from each other about what works in different countries, and of course encourage and cajole each other to do more. Because for me, the best thing about energy efficiency is that it, of course, doesn't just reduce our carbon emissions, as important though that is, it also supports people financially, as we saw in the energy crisis last winter, and unlocks a spending power that can be used across the whole economy to generate jobs and growth in a really important area going forward. So thank you very much indeed, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much. Let's move from London to Armenia, a very different country. Ms. Petrosan, in 2020, only a few years ago, the IEA reported that buildings are Armenia's largest energy-consuming sector. And they highlighted the residential sector as probably the biggest area where energy efficiency needed to be addressed. With this in mind, I'd really love to hear more about the policies that you're exploring to unlock those energy efficiency gains that are so necessary.
Thank you. First of all attendees of this panel discussion, it's an honor for us. It's an honor to participate to this discussion, to share experience and gain knowledge of other countries in the field of energy efficiency provision. All of us already is aware, after 2 days discussions, that buildings are the biggest consumer of energy and emissions of GHG. So, meantime, we can say that buildings are something needed for people living conditions. These are places to provide favorable conditions in any period of time for different activities, be this living, be these activities for work or leisure. So this means that we can't avoid having buildings at all. We can't wake up one day and say we will not erect buildings at all after tomorrow. So we're going to do something with reducing the consumption of energy for needs, for using heating or cooling systems from the beginnings. So now let's see what each of the countries do, making its own small step in the direction of making the globe a little bit green. The government of Armenia considers energy savings as a means of increasing the country's energy security, economic competitiveness, and recycling the negative impact of global warming on the environment. The policy pursued by the government is to promote energy saving in all branches of the economy. Due to 2021-2026 government program, the government's policy in the field of energy is aimed at increasing the level of energy independence and security, ensuring reliable and high-quality supply of electricity and gas to consumers. The key to the sustainable development of the energy sector are the economically justified, effective, and responsible use of renewable energy potential, the peaceful development of atomic energy, the regional integration of the electric power system, and the diversification of energy supply channels and forms. In the presence of limited reserves of fossil fuel in Armenian soil, the country used the extensive use and full inclusion of energy resources, including renewable energy. So we can emphasize that the comfortable environment is being created for investments in the energy sector, as a result of which the level of energy security is increasing. Until 2040, the energy sector development strategy outlines Armenia's vision in the energy sector, which is anchored in free competition and non-discriminatory, inclusive and diversified, with high level of energy independence, clean and energy saving, digitalized and innovative, knowledge-intensive, high-tech, predictable, and transparent, available on fair principles for all. As a result of these reforms, implemented within the framework of the strategy, with the help of the electronic platform launched in 2022, the electricity consumer in Armenia is given the opportunity to independently choose the supplier, sign a contract, and trade. This important reform is about the liberalization of the electricity market. New opportunities have been created for investors and power producers. The market is now free. those who can produce, import, and export electricity from Armenia if wished. Building, heating, cooling, and the use of various equipment are the biggest consumers in buildings. Along with improving the energy saving of the mentioned equipment, the efficient behavior of the consumer can make greater savings, bringing it up to 60%. In 2022, by decision of the government, a state support program for energy efficient renovation of apartments and individual residential houses was supported. And as you said, because the most of the housing stock in Armenia is out-timed, being erected in over 50 years ago, when the need for or the demand of or the norm standards haven't such a point as energy efficiency for the buildings. So we did this framework. The percent rates on renovation loans will be fully or partially subsidized by the government. Along with that, a number of strategic documents adopted by the government emphasizing the importance of energy efficiency in the construction sector, retrofitting buildings or new construction at all. These are the decision of government for the development of the energy sector, timetable for implementation of the measures in this direction, the government decree providing subsidies for the communities from the budget, state budget, which enabled a number of projects aimed at increasing energy savings to be implemented within the framework of subsidy programs on the principle of state-community co-financing. Also, updated data. Several EN and ISO standards on energy efficiency in buildings were harmonized and localized to the local context, such as energy performance of buildings, heating systems, energy performance ratings, building environment design guidelines, and so on. A lot of standards which make it obligatory to consider energy efficiency from the beginning, from the design phase up to implementation phase.
Ms. Lily,
yes.
President, I'm going to stop you there, partly because we're very tight on time, but also because you provided a perfect segue to the next speaker. I'm sorry, we've only got 10 minutes left for this session. So
Okay. Just one sentence I would like to finish with this, maybe in order to express the importance for including energy efficiency in the educational curricula, because the education give opportunity from the first phase, as I mentioned, to start considering the landscapes, which give opportunity for reducing the heating islands, etc., with natural means, not having electric equipment and trying to reduce to increase the energy efficiency. For the student, making the design for having natural circulation of the rooms and keeping the orientation of the buildings in the form to have this in natural forms. So these are things that from all levels can provide the energy efficiency, starting from design with the implementation in the local communities.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Pino, you work for the EU, European Commission, and Europe, when you go around the world, are perceived as leading the way in terms of regulation and guidance on how to achieve energy efficiency and climate targets. Could you tell us a little bit about the upcoming Energy Performance of Buildings Directive?
Sure, thank you, Joe, and it's good to be here again with you. Well, you mentioned the EU is leading the way on this field, but let me remind us all that we've been coming a long way, and this legislation that we hope will be now endorsed in the coming weeks, the Performance of Buildings Directive, it's already its third version. So we started with less ambition, and we've been learning the lessons and now adjusting, really adjusting this legislative framework. And the original directive actually was only saying how to do it, but was not really putting forward a clear objective. And we realized precisely, as was said before, with the big building stock, old building stock that we have in Europe, we need to do more. We need to also say how much do we need to improve the efficiency of buildings. It's not enough to say, if and when you renovate, you should do it this or that way. We concluded that with that regulatory framework, we were simply not doing progress enough. And so this revised framework sets out precisely that for residential buildings, by 2030, we will need to achieve a reduction in the primary use of energy in buildings of 16% compared to 2020. So very clear target in terms of emission reduction. We are not telling the member states which buildings. That is not imposed. It's really up to the member states to choose which buildings to go for, with one condition, with one exception, which is, but 55% of this 16% reduction does have to come from worst performing buildings. And why is that? Because by tackling the worst performing buildings, you're also really tackling energy poverty. You're tackling the buildings which are least insulated and which are making those who cannot afford the really efficient buildings to reduce their energy bills through better insulated, more efficient buildings. For that, of course, you also need the financial support. And we have an unprecedented volume of EU financing going into lending support in priority to those who most need and those who precisely live in this so-called worst performing buildings. So, in other words, we had to include the targets combined with the measures. But the measures, of course, are absolutely fundamental, and they are very clear. For instance, no more subsidies for fossil fuel or standalone fossil fuel boilers by 2025. It's still possible to finance hybrid boilers, but not standalone. And then a number of measures which cover several issues that have been raised before, which is, for instance, information about the building, which is reflected in the so-called passports of the buildings, because we know the renovation will not occur or will not probably be able to tackle the whole of the building at once. So let's have a kind of a passport which will tell us, okay, now I address the insulation and, if possible, with a solar panel. Further down in the road, I will add a heat pump, really giving also again a trajectory so that it doesn't have to necessarily happen overnight, because we know it does come with costs. And then within this revision of the directive, we tackle another enabler, again, financing. And we've heard also in the previous panel how important it is to provide guarantees, to bring in the private sector. And for that, we are working now with financial institutions and will be adopting, say, a secondary legislative act which is aimed at putting forward models aimed at incentivizing private investment into building renovations. Because we know that individually, you don't have a business case. If you want to renovate your house, it's very difficult to get a loan in the bank. So how can we pool that into whole neighborhoods, or how can we link that with specific mortgages which will aim at the renovation and linked with a more efficient building? Because you know, if you invest in the renovation of your house, it will also increase its value. So why not reflecting this, for instance, if you're taking a mortgage for the house? So this is a type of examples where we are trying to really cover the whole of the chain, so to say, combining targets with measures and the enabling framework. And to conclude, if I may, just to give to lend support to what has been said by Nune on the crucial importance of introducing indeed the awareness, the sensitivity to the topic already early at schools even, not just to sensitize young people for the importance of this, which, by the way, I have the feeling they are much more sensitized than many adults and seniors among us, but it's also in the interest of providing for the necessary skills, which, again, the worst thing would be if we have the vision, we have the certainty in terms of legislation, we have the financing means, and in the end we don't have the people we need to actually make it happen on the ground. And we're starting to face that scarcity. And in this sense, I've seen a very interesting project out there, which is a construction interactive game. It's one of the stands. I asked for the brochure so as to see if we can promote that in schools where my children go and see if they can have this. I think it's a good example of how to bring it down to schools and integrate it early on in the mindset of our young people.
Thank you. So you've heard from three very different contexts, the UK, Europe, Armenia. There is real action happening to drive energy efficiency. It has to be tailored to the building stock in the country, the capacity in the country. We have to grow that capacity. But I want to end with Mr. Minier from Schneider, because, of course, buildings are not just users of energy. They're there to also support the overall energy transition. And I hoped that you might end with talking a little bit about, do you see buildings as part of the problem or part of the solution? And what role does policy play in enabling the market here?
Yeah, thank you. I will just bring a couple of touch points because there are a lot of things that have been said. So regarding the contribution of building, it's obvious. As I told this morning, I mean, energy transition and building transformation will go hand in hand. On the role of the buildings on the emission reduction, we know that it's mostly the existing stock, but there is a wide variety of buildings, and it's a hard-to-abate sector. We speak a lot about the industry as a hard-to-abate sector, but it's a hard-to-abate sector for three reasons. The value chain is complicated, the granularity and the fragmentation of the type of buildings, and the financing. When you look especially to non-residential buildings. Residential building is complicated because you can have a diversity of houses. But it's really one point I wanted to bring, so difficult to scale up. So we see a lot of initiative everywhere. One point is, in fact, non-residential buildings are in fact usually more consuming, and you get more savings in renovating non-residential buildings, but you have less productized solutions. If I take a wide range of non-residential building, you will install industrial heat pumps to decarbonize, but these are not as productized as the heat pumps that you can find in residential. So it's not easy. Fully agree on the point that renovation is not like new building. It's not right from scratch. Stage renovation, but you have to make no regret choices, and energy efficiency is the first thing to do. And then you bring smartness and eventually rooftop solar. On the policy side, just one point very interesting is that it's a multi-stage effort. Countries at national level, you have targets. There is deployment, but I think my message would be that cities have more power than they think. You spoke about New York with their cap and fine system. You have Tokyo with a cap and trade system. You have Sweden with the tax and subsidies. I think cities should be more confident. I recall the Helsinki example where they decided to change their district heating into a fully decarbonized system, and it came up with an industrial heat pump because they had water aside. So I really encourage cities to be creative. They have more power than they think.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you to all our panelists. I'm afraid that we don't have time for questions. And I'm going to wrap up this question really by just leaving you with a couple of thoughts to sum it up. We can't rely on electrification and decarbonising grid electricity to address heating and cooling. We have to improve energy efficiency, and we need to be thinking about improving the fabric of buildings through passive design, and then adding on top of that, where necessary, active systems, rather than just leaping to those active systems. There are huge co-benefits. It's come from several panelists talking about the fact that energy efficiency also means addressing energy poverty. It also means addressing vulnerability to heat waves. And so this is necessary. It's not an option, and it's not just about driving down greenhouse gas emissions. We might think about shifting our focus or including in our focus both individual buildings, but also thinking about the city scale. You know, is the answer district heating solutions? Some of the things we heard from our previous panelists about actually the design of individual buildings and green facades. Financial markets are going to need to pivot to enable greater access to funding and incentivize energy efficiency improvements. But it's governments, both national and subnational, particularly in cities where most of the buildings are, who have a key role in creating the conditions for transformational change, as policymakers, as regulators, but also because they procure so much of the building stock. And we've heard from our panelists all the incentives that are created to actually build capacity to create the market that's needed. But finally, I wanted to end by actually saying international collaboration is also key. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for the Paris Agreement and the COP process. The COP Buildings Breakthrough and the Global Cooling Pledge demonstrate the ambition that exists by nations globally to collective action and coming to events like this and sharing their experiences. I hope it's worthwhile for you to have been here this afternoon. Thank you for joining us, and let's thank our panelists once more. Thank you.